The Ottoman Empire was once the terror of Europe. Their powerful army carved out a huge empire and planned to conquer the world. But their plans were halted by just a few hundred men on the tiny island of Malta. Today we will see how just 700 men saved Europe from Ottoman conquest. This is Knowledge Voyage. By the 1500s, the Ottomans had smashed army after army. Their powerful and charismatic Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had seized territory from Persia to Hungary. Their allies in North Africa's Barbary coast were also slave raiding against the Europeans. However, Suleiman had his eyes on perhaps the ultimate prize, Rome. His plan was to march his army into St. Peter's Square and lift the banner of Islam over its roof, as his ancestors had done with the Hagia Sophia when they captured Constantinople in 1453. But only one thing stood in his way: the Knights of Malta. The Knights of Malta were the last of three great Crusader orders. The most famous, the Templars, had been destroyed by the French on jumped-up charges of witchcraft. The Teutonic Order had crumbled to insignificance after the Northern Crusades against Russia, but the Knights of Malta were the last ones left. Originally based on the Greek island of Rhodes, they had been forced to evacuate their base there after it was captured by the Ottomans after a grueling siege in 1522. The Knights were homeless until Spanish King Charles V granted them the gift of Malta. Charles V needed someone prepared to guard the sea lanes of the Mediterranean from Barbary Muslim pirates from North Africa. Malta was not as fertile as Rhodes, and was perceived as something of a step down for the Knights, who were used to their lush former home. However, Malta would prove to be excellent for the Knights. The Knights of Malta were principally sea raiders, Christian pirates attacking Turkish Islamic shipping and Barbary slave raiders. From Rhodes they had struggled because it was so close to Turkey the Turks could physically see what they were up to. Rhodes lay just 11 miles from the Turkish mainland. By contrast, Malta was far from Ottoman eyes, lying 850 miles away, allowing the Knights of Malta to launch attacks with far greater surprise. Its location in the middle of the Mediterranean was perfect, and it allowed them to pounce on shipping lanes linking North Africa with Turkey. In the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, the Sultan's patience was running out. The final straw was when the Knights captured a ship with high Ottoman officials on board. The Sultan decided that the threat to the Knights to his ships must be ended once and for all. He planned to crush the Knights on Malta, and then use Malta as a stepping stone to invade southern Italy on the way to Rome. The Ottomans had captured Constantinople, the second Rome, and they hoped now to capture the first. To the Sultan, lifting the banner of Islam over the capital of the Catholic world would be a fine triumph. The only thing standing between the Ottomans and the conquest of Europe was the tiny Knights of Malta, led by Jean de Valette. Born into a noble French family, de Valette had been captured by Muslims and forced to work as a galley slave. Fortunately for him, he was eventually released as part of a prisoner exchange, otherwise he would have ended his days in unimaginable misery. He had also fought at the Siege of Rhodes decades earlier. Valette rejoined the Knights of Malta and was in charge of organising the island's defences. Valette's spies in Turkey told him that the Sultan's shipyards were a hive of activity, building a huge fleet, and Valette knew exactly where this fleet was probably headed. Valette sent out word to all the Knights of Europe, calling them to Malta. The Reformation had destroyed the English wing of the Knights of Malta, and just a single Englishman, Oliver Starkey, was left. This could explain why the Siege of Malta was not often written about in the English-speaking world. The defence of Malta hinged on several facts. The Knights of Malta had lost their former home, the island of Rhodes, to the Ottomans. Despite courageous resistance, Rhodes had been easy for the Ottomans to conquer for three reasons. Firstly, Rhodes was so close to Turkey itself, it was easy to spy on the island and see what the Knights were up to in terms of preparations and movements. Secondly, this proximity meant it was easy for the Ottomans to send new supplies across each day. Finally, Rhodes was large and fertile, so the attackers could live off the land while they waited for supplies. Valette carefully surveyed Malta and came to a conclusion. Unlike Rhodes, Malta was very far from Turkey. This meant the Turks could not spy on the Knights' movements. This great distance also meant that the Turks would have to bring all their supplies with them, as they could not resupply daily from Turkey. And lastly, Malta was small and not very fertile, so the Turks had limited options for living off the land. The lessons learned from the loss of Rhodes would be applied to the defence of the Knights' new home. All this meant Valette had one objective: hold off the Turks until the supplies they had brought with them ran out and they would be forced to leave. And this would be far from easy. The Knights of Malta had only managed to raise 700 knights, supported by 8,000 Maltese militia. Unfortunately for the Knights, the Turks were taking the invasion of Malta very seriously. The Knights of Malta had wreaked havoc on Turkish ships, and the Sultan was now 70 years old. If he was to fulfill the prophecy of capturing Italy and Rome, he needed to move fast. He split his command into two. The army would be commanded by Mustafa Pasha, a man with an impressive military pedigree and whose ancestors had fought in the earliest campaigns of the Prophet Muhammad himself. The Turkish navy was commanded by Admiral Piali. Piali was a white Christian orphan, found wandering the streets of Belgrade after the Sultan had captured it. He had converted to Islam and had a skill for ships. The Turks launched 190 ships, each bristling with food, cannons and gunpowder, and among them were 6,000 elite Janissary troops. Janissaries were boys taken from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained to be elite shock troops. There were around 40,000 Janissaries in total, and we can safely assume that the 6,000 sent to Malta were an elite of an elite. As well as their elite troops, the Turks brought thousands of regular troops from across their wide empire. The Turks had their advantages. They had a monstrously large fleet, a vast army, and decades of experience besieging and conquering Christian territory. However, despite their small size, the Knights of Malta had their own advantages. One of the chief ones was the experience of sieges. As the crusading order that they were, they had the knowledge of the way Christian troops in the Crusades had to operate. That is, far from home in hostile environments where communications and supplies from home took months. As a result, the Knights of Malta built their forts to be particularly hard to breach. They also made sure that each fort was self-contained and well equipped to last for months. The Knights of Malta were also hospitallers or medics by trade, and as a result were careful to practice hygiene to prevent disease outbreaks during sieges. The Turks made landfall on Malta, and Valette allowed the knights to confront them. This initial skirmish was to get the younger knights used to battle and raise morale, but after this, the knights pulled back to the fort of St. Elmo. Don Garcia of Spain had told Valette that the key to Europe was Malta, and the key to Malta was Fort St. Elmo. The Knights of Malta had a fine history of gallant stands against the odds stretching back to the Crusades, but this was different. If the Knights of Malta lost on Malta, there would be nowhere left to retreat. Europe would be invaded, and the Knights of Malta order would be extinguished. Fort St. Elmo would be the scene of one of the finest episodes in European courage. Unlike Rhodes, where the Turks had only one fort to capture, on Malta there were several smaller forts that each needed to be captured. Making matters tougher, each fort was on a narrow, rocky peninsula that was tricky to approach. The Turkish could not hold the island without eliminating the threat of all the forts. Valette knew that he had to hold off the Turks until their supplies ran out. For every day St. Elmo could resist, the Turks would be a day closer to defeat. The Turks lined up their heavy cannons and began a pitiless night-and-day attack on St. Elmo. After heavy bombardment, the Janissaries were sent forward in a mass wave attack. However, the knights were ready. The Knights of Malta had special incendiary grenades called a trump, because of the trumpet-like noise the fuse made as it burned. Once it exploded, sticky gel coated in fire would explode onto the enemy. Think of it as an early napalm grenade. As the Janissaries swarmed onto the walls, the trumps were hurled at them. Their flowing cotton robes were great for the hot desert, but the worst possible clothes to catch fire. Over 2,000 Janissaries died in this mass attack, many burning to death. The Turks resumed their attacks, and for weeks this went on. The Turks were becoming increasingly angry, as a siege they believed would take 3 to 4 days was now into its 20th day, a testament to the courage and endurance of the knights. Each night, swimmers would sneak across the bay with messages to Valette in Fort St. Michael's, and he would send volunteer knights across to help at St. Elmo. Turkish commander Dragut suggested bombarding St. Elmo from all sides would quicken its fall. He was an experienced commander who wore a colourful turban, but this made him stand out, and a Maltese sniper took him out. His loss was a big blow to the Turks. As this bombardment raged day and night, Don Garcia of Sicily was contacted and his support desperately requested. However, Garcia did not want to risk his fleet against the Turks, believing if it was lost in battle, there would be no way to replace it. The brave men in Fort St. Elmo were on their own. The night before the final assault by the Ottomans, the knights across the bay saw sparkly electricity forming near the flagpole. This is known as St. Elmo's fire, a common electrical discharge often seen on ship masts. And for the knights trapped in St. Elmo, they saw the blue light as a sign that their saint was with them in their final hours. After a month of courageous resistance, the Knights of Malta in St. Elmo rang the chapel bell to signal to their brother knights across the bay that they were ready to die. Sacred treasures were buried to prevent them being desecrated, and the knights took the last rites and said confession, preparing for their inevitable death. The Janissaries swarmed in, and after brutal fighting, finally took St. Elmo. A smoke signal was lit to show the fall of the fort was imminent, and moments later, a red Turkish flag was lifted from the ramparts. The Knights of St. Elmo all died, but not before they had killed over 2,000 enemy troops, inflicting a massive 6-to-1 kills to losses ratio. Surveying the aftermath, the Turkish commander compared the small fort of St. Elmo to the large fort of St. Michael in the distance, comparing them to a son and a father. If so small a son has cost us so dear, what price shall we pay for so great a father? The Knights of Malta had their bodies desecrated and beheaded by vengeful Ottomans. Some knights were shot to death with arrows, others were disemboweled. The Ottomans nailed the bodies to crosses and floated them across the bay to the neighbouring Fort St. Michael with a clear message: you are next. Valette replied by having all Turkish prisoners beheaded in retaliation and fired their severed heads from a cannon across at the Ottoman troops. Unlike the chivalry shown by both sides at the Siege of Rhodes 50 years earlier, this was a visceral, brutal fight to the death. After capturing St. Elmo, the Ottomans contacted Valette to see if he was prepared to surrender land and spare them another costly attack. When the Turks offered Valette the deal, he told them the only land they would get would be the land he filled up with the bodies of their troops. During the siege, the knights spotted a Turk trying to get their attention and swam across the bay, where he was rescued. It turned out his name was Lascaris, a Greek-born soldier. He was the descendant of the same family that had produced 3 Byzantine emperors. He was a senior advisor to the Turks, but the courage of the knights had stirred him to defect. His information would prove vital. The Turks now began their attack on Fort St. Michael's. At French Creek, they swam out to try and cut the ship traps laid by the knights just below the water level. However, the Maltese locals swam out to meet them with daggers in their teeth and stabbed the Turks to death in the bay. The Turks were furious and stepped up their bombardment of St. Michael's Fort. The bombing was so loud it could be heard on islands 100 miles away. On 5 occasions, the Turks broke into the fort and all 5 saw them repelled by the knights. At just the moment the Turks looked set to win, a panicked rumour spread that their base camp was being plundered by a raiding party. The Turks fled back to their camp to find a Christian raiding party of cavalry from the main Maltese city had attacked it while the Turks were fighting at St. Michael. Realising he had overreacted in pulling back his entire force, Pasha boomed he would kill all Knights of Malta but keep John Valette alive so he could present him in chains as a slave of the Sultan. When Valette heard of Pasha's plans, he said he would never give the Sultan the satisfaction of seeing a Knight Order head bowing at his feet. He said if capture looked imminent, he would change into a regular uniform so as not to be recognised and die alongside his men. The Turks built a siege tower to help them attack the fort of St. Michael. However, the Knights of Malta had a plan. They were experts at marine warfare, and on the sea, chain shots were often a common weapon. 2 cannonballs connected by a chain would be fired at an enemy ship's mast to disable it. They applied this on land and shattered the legs of the siege tower with the same technique, sending Turkish troops flying. Turkish troops began to report seeing strange spirit beings called jinn by the Muslims, following John Valette along the city walls. To the Muslim Ottomans, the jinn are mysterious spirit beings, but to the Christians, these beings were angels. Speaking of the Turks, they were becoming very nervous. The siege had taken many weeks longer than they expected, and they had only brought enough food and ammunition for a short siege. Making matters worse, their supplies from North Africa were being ruthlessly sunk by Christian pirates. Valette's strategy was vindicated. He knew that since Malta was so far from Turkey, they would need to bring their supplies with them, and thus risked running out of them before the siege could be won. Furthermore, Malta was so barren, the Turks could not get supplies from the island itself. The Turks were now in a desperate place. The 2 Turkish commanders argued furiously. The Navy commander said he wanted to pull his ships out before the winter storms hit, whether or not the army was ready to go with them. The army decided that if they had to leave soon, they would capture and plunder the island's capital city so they had at least something to take back to the Sultan. However, the governor of the city had every civilian dressed in army uniforms and marched around the ramparts. The Turks despaired at what seemed like an enormous force when they spied them in the distance. With supplies running out, morale low, and thousands of Turks dead, they made the decision to leave. After 4 months of stunning courage, the Knights of Malta won and had driven the most powerful Sultan's forces out. News spread fast throughout Europe, and church bells began ringing Te Deum victory tones to celebrate Europe being saved. The island was called the Bulwark of the Faith and the Island of the Heroes. Despite being a Catholic order, even Protestant Queen Elizabeth of England congratulated them. The Turkish armies returned to Constantinople in disgrace. The Sultan had sent the cream of his forces to capture Malta, and just 700 knights had driven them back. The Sultan took a dim view towards those who failed him, and wisely, the commander sent a fast boat ahead of them to give him the news and give him time to calm down before they arrived. The Sultan peppered the men with abuse, saying, "I see it is only in my hand that my sword is invincible. In other words, if you want something done right, do it yourself." He vowed to personally lead a second attack on Malta the following year. However, the 70-year-old Sultan did not have long left, and he died before he had the chance. His plan to conquer Italy and lift the Ottoman flag over St. Peter's Square was over. The disgraced Ottomans had a phrase in their language, Malta yok, which means there is no Malta. It was the first ever major military defeat the Turks suffered in centuries. On Malta, the 2 villages that saw the heaviest fighting were renamed Vittoriosa and Invita, victorious and unbeaten. The Turkish defector Lascaris would remain on Malta, converted to Christianity and therefore rejoin the faith of his ancestors. John Valette would die in 1568. He was buried in the chapel of Our Lady of Victory. It was Our Lady of Victory who the Catholic neighbours of Europe would credit with another major victory over the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto 7 years later. Shortly before he died, Valette was asked to lay the foundations of a new city in Malta. In honour of his courage, it was named Valletta, and it is this city that will forever bear the name of one of Europe's greatest heroes. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you.